Iran's leadership is put to the test as violent protests continue. Tehran blames foreign elements for stirring up trouble. So is the unrest about the economy, or is it anti-establishment? And how will Iran deal with the growing public anger? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ahelbarra. You may have seen our show earlier this week about the protests in Iran. The situation has only got worse since then. Mostly peaceful demonstrations have turned violent. At least 22 people have been killed and hundreds arrested. Protests that seem to be about rising prices and financial struggles now appear to be anti-establishment. But it's unclear who is organizing the rallies. All we know is it isn't the reformists who traditionally lead demonstrations in Iran. The international community has been quick to condemn the violence, and the US wants the United Nations to act. Mike Hanna has this report from the UN headquarters in New York.
Ambassador Nikki Haley called a briefing to outline US priorities at the United Nations in this new year. And top of her list, the situation in Iran.
If the Iranian dictatorship's history is any guide, we can expect more outrageous abuses in the days to come. The UN must speak out. In the days ahead, we will be calling for an emergency session, both here in New York and at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. We must not be silent. The people of Iran are crying out for freedom. All freedom-loving people must stand with their cause.
This echoing sentiments expressed by President Trump earlier, who said in a tweet, "The people of Iran are finally acting against the brutal and corrupt Iranian regime. All of the money that President Obama so foolishly gave them went into terrorism and into their pockets. The people have little food, big inflation, and no human rights. The US is watching." There's little evidence in the streets of Tehran of the turmoil evident in some other parts of the country, but there are deep concerns expressed about the rise in food prices and drop in employment.
I'm working, but in this society I'm always stressed about the possibility of getting fired the next day. Always being worried about my job, my family, the security of my family. The main problems people are grappling with are their security, the economy, and their livelihood.
There are some who are poor and cannot make ends meet. What should they do? Life is really difficult. We're tenants. I have a daughter and son, both at school. The high prices really put me under pressure at home.
Iran's supreme leader has broken his silence on the protests, accusing Iran's enemies of responsibility.
The enemy is waiting for an opportunity, for a crack through which it can infiltrate. Look at the recent events. All those who are at odds with the Islamic Republic have used various means, including money, weapons, politics, and intelligence apparatus, to create problems for the Islamic system, the Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Revolution.
News agency footage reveals ongoing protest in a number of regions. Hundreds are reported to have been arrested, and demonstrators continue to defy an attempted government blackout of social media. Back at the United Nations, the new president of the Security Council has confirmed the US has been in contact and discussions are ongoing. But it's not clear at this stage whether the US appetite for a formal meeting is shared by the rest of Security Council members. Some may be reluctant to intervene in what they would regard as an internal domestic dispute. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, United Nations.
We heard there from Iran's supreme leader about who he thinks is behind the unrest. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani also delivered a response.
It should be clear to everyone that we are people of freedom, and according to the Constitution and citizens' rights, people are free to express their criticism and to protest. However, we need to pay attention to the manner of that criticism and protest. It should be in such a way that it will lead to the improvement of the people and the state.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Doha, Mahjoob Zweiri, Associate Professor at Qatar University and Specialist on Iran Foreign Policy. From Tehran is Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, a political commentator and specialist on Iranian domestic affairs. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Khoshcheshm this. What is happening now in Iran? Is it a power struggle between the reformists and the conservatives or the hardliners, or is it a new phenomenon in the country?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, no. As a matter of fact, people have disappeared from the streets. I mean, those that were raising rightful economic demands and the ones who were taking part in protests, against President Rouhani's austerity plan. Now there have remained very few rioters. But just today, tens of thousands of people in different cities took out to the streets to show their support for the government and for the establishment. This is one of the very few cases and rare cases where different camps, from even the Green Movement supporters to the reformists and to the principalists that you just called conservatives, they're standing all together. They are standing behind the government and the establishment, stressing that people are entitled to shout their protests at economic flaws and faults. But they are all standing against riots, because people who took part in the demonstrations against riots today, they were demanding action by the government against the rioters who have caused several, businesses, shops to shut down, especially in those very few cities that have witnessed riots.
I'll come back to you later to talk in detail about the situation. Mr. Zweiri, Khoshcheshm is of the view that this is losing momentum across the country.
As you know, this demonstration started with the economic motivation. And of course, it was, demanding specific matters from the government. The focus was on the decision made by the government about the budget, about the increasing taxes and other issues. Now, what we see that in the last 48 hours, it's obvious that the government has followed different strategies to deal with the situation. And to me, it's very clear that the establishment, the political establishment, the regime as a whole, has in a way or other directed the government to act accordingly to respond to the concerns of the people who are on the street. It was obvious that the President Rouhani 2 days ago had met the member of the parliament, and he asked them that his government is considering review the budget and submit it to the parliament, and basically taking different measures to reduce the pressure on people. To me, this is a very governmental tactic to convince the people that the government is sincere to take into consideration their demands. But the question is how long the government will accept that and act according to that.
Okay, Mr. Khoshcheshm, can we say that what triggered the protests in Tehran was basically the general discontent over poverty, corruption, and unemployment?
Well, when the protests started, they started because of some financial banks, private banks actually, and some financial institutions went bankrupt, and people were angry at these private, institutions. The government promised help, but it has taken some time for them to bring help to these poor people. This started in Mahjoob, then economic, austerity protests started in some 20, 30 cities. But very soon after, some people were manipulated by social media platforms, admittedly funded and run from the West. They emptied the streets, they disappeared from the streets, and now we see these protests in 7, 8 cities. The same thing is true with regard to Tehran. we have not seen a united protest in Tehran except for 50 students who appeared in the streets for 2 days on Saturday and Sunday in front of Tehran University. They were confronted by 200 opposing university protesters who were condemning the first group of protesters, and we have not seen any major protest ever since then. Some nights, as you can see, groups of 20, 30 people in central Tehran or northern Tehran walking together, but there is not much activity, and because there is no single leadership, in this riots. Basically, if you just allow me to explain about the numbers, maybe in the next question.
Sure, I will. Joining us also to talk about the protests in Iran is Trita Parsi. He is founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Mr. Parsi, I mean, there's been all those theories about who are these people on the streets. Are they a silent majority? Is this a new phenomenon in Iran? Or are they people who have been manipulated by the clerical establishment to take advantage of the situation in Iran?
Well, the first thing we can say is that clearly this is a different segment of society than what we saw in 2009. This appears to be a segment that is not as involved politically, not as experienced politically, and have not been at the center of Iran's political developments for the last 20 years. It is also a poorer segment of society that is much more negatively affected by the dire economic situation, particularly some of the measures that had been proposed in this new budget, such as cuts to cash handouts as well as increase in fuel prices. But we also have to acknowledge that this discontent in society, not just with the economic situation, but with the social situation, with the political situation, is quite deep and very, very widespread. So even if the numbers are much smaller, there's also clearly people who are not out there in the streets, but nevertheless very sympathetic, perhaps not to the methodology of the protest, but with the grievances of the protesters.
Mr. Zweiri, Mr. Parsi says this is, although the numbers are not huge compared to 2009, but this is quite significant. It could be ushering into something quite new in Iran. We've seen the slogans, people upset about the situation of the country. Can we say that President Rouhani, has failed to deliver on the promises he made during the presidential campaign?
As you know, President Rouhani, on the first term of his presidency, his focus was the nuclear deal. And he promised, of course, Iranian that, the political situation will be changed. And he promised that this cannot be done without fixing the foreign policy issue as a whole, including the nuclear deal. And I think based on that, he was elected in the first time. So as the deal was signed in summer 2015, the hope was this deal will bring, a new support to the economic situation in Iran. And assuming that the money, there will be removing of sanction, Iran will be open up for foreign investment. The political situation and will affect the economic situation, assuming that there will be a change on the economic dynamic in Iran. With Trump comes to power, unfortunately, things has changed. President Trump, he was not happy with the deal. He was not happy of Iranian foreign policy, and he started with demonizing Iran again. And we went back to the time where Republicans like Bush the father and the son were in power. So basically, that time is coming back with Donald Trump, and he started to criticize Iran and focusing on the nuclear deal itself as a reason to help Iran.
Okay.
And I think that was an important issue to see these kind of demonstrations.
Mr. Khoshcheshm, I would like to go back to the proposed budget for 2018, which many believe was the main trigger of the protest. It suggests slashing some of the social welfare programs, but at the same time, it expands the budget or the allocations for the military establishment, particularly the Revolutionary Guard, and for some of the clerical establishments in Iran. Do you think that this budget will be shelved and a new one will be presented to answer some of the concerns of the people?
Attention should be paid to the fact that before 2005 or 6, the Americans tried lots of ways in order to topple the Islamic Republic, including riots and colorful revolutions. But since 2009 or 8, they came to realize that they cannot do that, but they can use riots and protests in order to lay pressure on Tehran, to justify sanctions, to pressure Tehran to give up its components of power that include its missile industry, nuclear industries, and its regional clout. They are looking at these riots the same way, When they started, there were protests about the government's austerity plans for the next year, but very soon, the social media platforms run from abroad, they started manipulating people and provoking them to, practice harsh, actions, to do harsh actions, and, to sabotage, to raid military bases, they even teach them how to make Molotov cocktails, and that means war and terrorism. So they've been encouraging them to go for riots. Why? Because Donald Trump is going to make a number of decisions in coming weeks. In the next 2 weeks, he is to decertify or recertify the nuclear deal with Iran, and he also is to make a decision about further suspension of the sanctions. And it was an analysis before, but now, after what the spokesperson of the White House said, and many other officials in Washington, it has come under the spotlight that they mean to use these riots in order to justify reimposition of a part of the sanctions and ratifying new sanctions to keep Tehran under pressure in order to force Tehran to give up a part of its regional role.
Okay.
That's why, basically, they are trying, with the help of Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're trying to provoke people to continue the riots until Saturday especially.
Okay, since you've been mentioning the foreign intervention, which has been reiterated by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and many officials, Mr. Parsi, to stay with this particular point, if Trump continues tweeting about the unrest in Iran, is there any concern that this could backfire in a sense that it will just feed the government narrative that this is something done by people manipulated by the enemies of Iran?
I think that, what Trump is doing is not helpful. I don't think he's trying to help the protesters who do have legitimate grievances. Rather, he's just trying to fan the flames and try to help create more instability. At the same time, I don't think people in Iran are listening to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not a respected person. Whether you are sympathetic to the government of Iran or opposed to it, Donald Trump is not viewed as your friend, mindful of the very anti-Iranian and policies that he's pursued that have been very antagonistic towards the Iranian people as a whole, including, for instance, the Muslim ban that has been affecting Iranians more than any other nationalities. We should not forget that when ISIS struck Tehran and killed 17 people, Donald Trump condemned Iran and blamed it on Iran. This is probably the first and only time the United States has given ISIS a pass. All of these different steps have created a situation in which the people of Iran are not viewing Donald Trump as a friend. But then that also means that it makes it more difficult for the Iranian government to try to paint the protesters as simply people that are being inspired or following Donald Trump.
Mr. Zweiri, the protesters also have been very critical of the Iranians' intervention in regional affairs, particularly in places like Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, saying enough is enough. We don't care about Syria, we care about our own selves. The protests, are they likely to put more pressure on the Iranian government to further intervene in those places?
I think what is important about the slogan is the fact that the government, the establishment of Iran has failed to convince its own people that its foreign policy was going in the right direction. That slogan does confirm that the media, what was broadcast through the media in Iran, what's being said by the officials, what's being publicized, that Iran's presence in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen is in favor of Iran, is protecting Iran, in reality was not really convincing to the Iranians. Iranians was saying on those demonstrations that we need you to take care of us. So basically, all of what's been said has not been convincing to the people. The second point, I think, in that context, we have to mention that, again, the establishment did not consult the people on its foreign policy. It did it based on its own view on the interest of the establishment and the regime itself, and assuming that this represents the Iranians' interest. And I think this demonstration will not affect the decision of Iranian government where to go after this. The only thing I assume that will have impact is that the gap the gap between the government, the regime, and the people will be wider and wider when it comes to the foreign policy and Iranian behavior in the region.
Mr. Khoshcheshm, are we likely to see the government heed some of those concerns voiced by the people, particularly when it comes to the regional involvement, or do you believe this is something which is vital for Iran's national security and therefore there's absolutely no compromise on this?
Let me add one more point. When we're talking about Donald Trump himself and upfront policy, my colleague was right. Donald Trump has proved to be an enemy of the Iranian nation. He has called the nation as a terrorist nation, and no one cares for Donald Trump here. But when we are talking about behind-the-scene decision makings, they have even done lots of things in order to provoke these riots. Just yesterday, they declared that they are viewing and studying different ways in order to promote and to bring more social networks and platforms to Iran in order to connect these riots and to have them continue. Why? They intend to intensify clashes and they intend to escalate the tensions. So far, Iranian officials, the government and the IRGC especially, they have shown self-restraint, and they do not mean to clamp down on these riots, despite the fact that they have been harming public and private properties. But the United States intends to escalate the tensions to force Iranian IRGC and law enforcement and others clash with these protesters, with these rioters, not protesters. Protests ended just a few days ago. Now we are just only witnessing riots and damaging of properties in order to justify the CATSA sanctions that they ratified a couple of months ago and against the IRGC. That's the plan they are pursuing, and that's why they insist so much that they want these riots continue in the next week after millions of Iranians are to get out on Friday, especially in Tehran, to show their support again for the establishment and against these riots. Now they want these riots to continue in the next week exactly for the same purpose, because IRGC has warned that it would enter the scene in the next week if these riots do not come to an end.
And this takes us to the next question. Mr. Parsi, what are the options for the Iranian government? Will it continue the clampdown on the protesters, or do you think, because of the growing general sentiment among the international community that enough is enough, we might see some compromises in the near future?
Well, if there's a compromise, I don't think it's going to be as a result of what the international community says. It's going to be based on other calculations. I think there's a realization in the Rouhani government that there is a lot of legitimate grievances on behalf of the protesters, and that some changes are needed to be made to this budget, because the difficulty that the Rouhani government has had is to fulfill the expectations that it itself helped to set when it came to what the economic prospects for the country would be in a post-JCPOA, in a post-nuclear deal environment. It has not been able to meet those. It's not entirely its own fault. A lot of it is as a result of the Trump administration creating so much political uncertainty about the future of the nuclear deal, which has then caused a lot of financial institutions to refuse to finance investments in Iran. When investments are not being made in Iran, jobs are not being created. Iran's economy is moving in the right direction on paper with more than 4% growth, but that's mainly because of oil sales. Oil sales don't create jobs, investments do. And it's been very difficult for the Rouhani government to attract investments as a result of what's happening with the nuclear deal.
Unfortunately,
I think the Rouhani government is going to have a couple of days to be able to make some changes to the budget and try to meet the protesters' Otherwise, as has been suggested, the IRGC is likely going to step in, and then we will see a much more brutal crackdown against the protesters and the potential repeat of the brutality that we saw in 2009.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you very much indeed, Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, Mahjoob, Zweiri, and Trita, Parsi. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.